Hi there guys, my name is David and this is Learn That Photo. Today we are learning more Photoshop basics. We're going to load in a raw file, have a look at how that works in Photoshop, and also look at the clone tool and changing the image size. So let's start by loading in a raw file. I've got one here that I've picked out, and this is a .cr2 file, which is the Canon file type for raw files. It would be a different file type if it was from a Nikon camera or a Sony or any other brand. They each have their own type of raw file. So the .cr2, that is from Canon cameras. Now, I've drag and dropped my raw file, and what happens is it opens up Camera Raw. In this case, we're on Camera Raw 11.4. And if you've used Lightroom, it looks kind of like that. It's a slider-based raw editor. If you haven't, and this is the first time you're loading up a raw file, don't panic, it's all slider based, it's all pretty easy to navigate. There's not too much that you can do wrong unless you go crazy with it. So let's have a look at the basics and just stick to those for the moment. So over here we've got our temperature, we'll come back to that in a second, and then we've got our exposure, contrast, highlight, shadow, whites, and blacks, and they all do basically what the name says. The exposure changes the exposure. The contrast changes the contrast. For things like highlights, it's changing those bright parts of the image. For shadows, it's changing the dark parts of the image. And then the whites and blacks are your absolute white points and black points. So by raising that, you're taking out those black points. So they all have pretty self-explanatory uses, and it's just a slider system, right for more, left for less. Nothing too crazy. The most difficult part really is the color temperature. If you've never used white balance or set a white balance before, then when you start to edit raw files, that's the first time that it really becomes an apparent thing, an apparent part of the editing. Getting this right is crucial, otherwise the colors in your image will simply be wrong and it will make life really difficult to get the image right. So basically, if you've never come across white balance before, all light has basically a light temperature. And what that means is it basically has a different color value to it. Light isn't all white, it all has a different color value to it, a different place on that spectrum. So for example, the easiest way to put this across would be a candle. Candle flame would probably be quite orange, whereas an LED light, either in your home or on the headlight of a car, something like that, would be either more of a pure white or a kind of bluey colour. Those are different colour tones from that same thing, that source of light. And when you shine light on anything in your image, the colour of that light matters. That's what's bouncing back into the camera and giving you your photo. So if you're using a candle light, whatever that's lighting up in the photo is going to be more orange. If you're using a pink neon shop sign, then that light's going to shine on things and be quite pink. We have to be aware of these. We don't want to correct for all of these light sources. It depends on what we're doing. We might want that pink tone from the neon shop sign. But when we're using what should be quite naturally white looking light sources, daylight or a studio light or things like that, we want to make sure that we have the white balance temperature set correctly. The easiest way to do this when we're starting out is to use one light source, because if you have two light sources and they're different temperatures, you're going to have two different sets of colour falling on the subject. You might have a candle from the right hand side casting orange, and then you might have an LED light from the left casting blue, and you can't correct for both of them in the image. Or you can't until we get into more advanced editing at least, but it's very difficult to. So the best thing to do to begin with, so that we don't run into this issue, is just shoot using one light source, just the sunlight or just a flash or just the light bulbs in the room, whatever it may be. Use one main light source, and then when you're setting the white balance, the temperature, once you get it right for that light source, it's right for the entire image. That's the best thing that you can do to begin with, and then once you have a handle on that, start adding other lights down the line. But one light source makes this so much easier. So in this portrait we've got one light source. It was a studio light, so I know roughly where this should be anyway. But let's say we didn't. The easiest way, if we don't know the exact white balance temperature, is that to the right we'll add yellow to the image, and to the left we'll add blue to the image. You can see the difference that makes. The candle would be more on this side, the LED would be more over there. Now technically we might think the candle would be a high white balance number, but the way that the scale works is a little bit more complicated than that. This is basically a number for the amount of correction we're applying, but I don't want to overcomplicate things, so slider to the right adds yellow to the image to correct, and slider to the left adds blue. We'll just keep it at that just now, and we'll build on this later on. So I want it somewhere around here. There we go. And the tint doesn't normally need much of a change, but there are situations where we might have a slight tint from the bounce light or from the lights themselves. If you have a cheaper studio light, it might be a little bit more red or green or things like that. At the moment, it can stay just exactly where it is. Exposure wise, we don't need to change, but the great thing with a raw file is that if we had misshot this, let's say the settings were wrong on the camera and we were way down here on the exposure, with a raw file we can pull this all back in the raw editing, or at least most of it, a lot more than if we had a JPEG file. If we photographed this and this was the JPEG that came off the camera, all the detail down here, all the detail in the dark bits of the hair would be lost. With a raw file, there's a good chance that we could pull the exposure up and bring all that detail back in. So there's a lot of debate on forums and a lot of misconception around why should we shoot in RAW or why should we shoot in JPEG or which one's better. RAW files and JPEGs both have their place. RAW files are huge, so they will take up more memory. If you don't plan on doing any editing, if you're just taking, say, snapshots for research and you're never going to edit and print them, they're just research for maybe a uni paper or something, you don't need the raw files. But if you're going to do, say, a portrait that will be hung on the wall and you want the lighting and the colour and the editing to be spot on, the raw file will give you all that raw data from the camera and you'll have a much better chance of getting a really good end image. So they both have their place, but in photography terms, generally raw files more often than not are the way to go. So this is how we would then edit those raw files. At the moment, I don't want to do too much in the raw side. We've got the white balance set. I think maybe dropping the highlights down a little bit. And a little drop on the shadows, and a little drop on the exposure. There we go. And that's all I want to. Maybe actually just a tiny drop on the vibrance, just to make it a little bit more that kind of moody cinematic, sort of like that slightly desaturated, almost fine art kind of style. We'll veer towards that end. There we go. So that's looking okay. And at the moment, that's all I want to do. So we just click Open Image. And that will process that raw and bring it up. And now we have our working image in Photoshop. We haven't had to use a program like Lightroom. We've just drag and dropped the raw file into Photoshop and we're ready to go. So from here, I want to maybe crop this in a bit, because there's a little bit of backdrop that isn't in there, so I could crop it in like this. And I'm just using the rectangular marquee tool for that, so I could select the area and go Image Crop, and that would solve that. But another way that we could do things is with the clone tool. So this clone tool over here basically is a copying stamp, copying brush. We have to use Alt and click to tell it where to copy from. We can click there to tell it to copy there, and then wherever we paste, we'll put that part of the image. Just copies one part to another. And what seems like such a basic tool actually has so many uses. We can take out blemishes, we could take out, say, a boat when it's on water, or take out a wrinkle in a backdrop, or catch flyaway hairs, or whatever it may be. The clone tool can be used in so many different ways. So knowing how to use the basics of this tool really helps our editing. So let's go down to that little bit of backdrop. See down here. We'll just copy from just above, and we'll just paste. Make my brush smaller there, using the same shortcut as the last video, using Alt and right click, holding the two down. Drag right to make the brush bigger, drag left to make it smaller, and then just painting where I want it. I might go more on the opacity so I can blend this a little bit more as well. Make sure it's all blending in. Not too much of an issue. I always find zooming out actually helps a lot more on this. You can see it a little bit clearer. There we go. So that's how it was. We've now filled in that bit where the backdrop was missing. Now, if I made any mistakes on that, I could use the history tool there, but outside of that, they were all on that background layer. We were editing directly on the layer there, and that can cause us to run into issues. If I made too many mistakes there, maybe the history wouldn't go back enough spaces, and I might have to start the entire edit all over again. One way to avoid this, just like with layer masks, we can create another layer of this image and work on that instead, so that we still have separate layers for our editing. So to do that, right click on the layer, just duplicate layer. We now have a second version, and we could do all the other editing on this second layer, and then when we're finished we could merge it all down into one layer. But if there's any mistakes, we still have the original to go back to. And sometimes it's good practice that if you're doing any detail editing, after every so many stages, or each individual piece, like all your cloning and then all your whatever else you may be doing, spot heal or so on, you just make a new overall layer, so you've kind of got it saved in stages. So working in the layers, again, being one of the main things we want to be doing in Photoshop. So let's take this clone tool again. We've got a couple of little red marks up here. Let's just use the clone tool to take those out as well. So we'll copy a bit just beside, so Alt and click, and then we'll just go down here and paste it over. There we go. We'll do the same just here. You can see how easy it is just to clean up any blemishes at all. There we go. Now I don't always do this. It depends on the subject, really. It depends on and not so much the person, but the purpose of the photograph. If this is something like a family portrait, then I probably wouldn't do this unless it's requested, because you're there to capture the family, you're there to capture them in that stage of life. If it was maybe an advertising shot for, say, a makeup brand or a model or something like that, they will pretty much always, the advertising agency or the product company or whoever it may be, will always want every little detail edited. Everything has to look perfect, or what they perceive as perfect. So the amount of editing doesn't always depend on a specific amount that's right. It's generally more to do with the end use for that photograph. Same with things like landscape. You might want to edit every little detail to be perfect in a landscape image, or what you perceive as perfect in a landscape image. But if that's going to be used as a documentary photo of that area, then it's false. It's not actually documenting what's there. You've changed it. So always be careful about the amount of editing that you're doing, and try and make sure that it fits in with the intended purpose of that image. Now the clone tool again could be used for things like these flyaway hairs. Now there's a couple of them on this particular image, so I won't do them all, but just to show you, we could go like that and take them out from any of these bits. There we go. I could do that the whole way along. We would just have to make sure that what we are pasting matches where we're pasting it. So where you have the forehead meeting the hair, copy right on that line, go up, and that's where you would line up the clone tool. Otherwise you'd have a bit of forehead over the hair. So you have to make sure the background matches where you're copying from. You could do the same for little bits where there's just a little bit of the mascara there that's come off. And you could do the same thing for all these little bits here if that was something that was wanted. There we go. And any little flyaways on the back of the hair here, you could do the same thing for any of that. If there was, say, a little piece of fluff or dirt or dust or something that had been blown into the hair, you could take that out too. So it means that if you have spent days and days working on an image setup, working on something with a team of people, a makeup artist and a product team and a lighting guy and all the rest of it, and you're working on this big ad campaign, something like a little piece of dirt flying through the street at the wrong second doesn't ruin that entire image. Photoshop can just come in and take that right out, image saved. So that's where it's really handy, is little things like that. So that's the clone tool, and we can see, just clicking that on and off, just how much that can change things up. The next thing is resizing the image. So for that, there's two different things that we could be doing. Now there's image resize and there's canvas size as well. Now image basically changes the size of the entire image. We can use this box here, and you can change it based on the amount of pixels. So if you have a specific size that you have to upload to, now on Facebook it used to be 2048 on the long edge. I'm not sure if that's changed, that was a few years ago now, but that used to be everything had to be saved at 2048 or Facebook would basically ruin the quality of the image. I think it's a different amount now, but you'd also have to go and change that. It might be for a print. You might want a 6x4 inch print. What I would say though is keep this locked, because if you change this to 6 and this to 6, what you're going to do is stretch the image by changing the ratio, so we don't want to do that. We want to keep these locked. You can also change this based on centimeters, millimeters, things like that as well. And it just changes the image size. So let's go for something quite small. Let's go with that Facebook ratio of the 2048. And you'll see the difference there. Much smaller than the high-res version a moment ago. And that's how we would change the image size. We can also change the size of the canvas without changing the actual image file that's in there. So for that we could go image canvas size, and let's say we wanted to make the working area bigger, maybe to add another image in to create a collage or to put a border around it. The colleges and unis always seem to want a border around things, almost like an old photo mount. So let's do that. Let's add a little border around this. So we could go percent and maybe just add a 5% border around it. So if 100% is where it's already at, let's just go 105. And what that'll do is it'll put this extension on, and whatever we pick here will be what they put into that extension. Now you could use black or white or grey, or you could pick an individual colour. Let's just go white. And it's extended that canvas by 5% in each direction. We now have almost like a Polaroid sort of look. We now have that white border on there. And that might be needed for certain things, but both those do very different things. The canvas size changes the canvas, it doesn't affect the image file itself, it's changing the working space. Image size takes that size and scales it down or up. Now that's important to note because when it does that, when we use the image size one and it scales it down or up, you're compressing those pixels or stretching those pixels, so that's going to have an effect on the quality of the image, so try not to do that too often, only when needed, and generally only at the end of an edit. So there's a quick run through a couple more tools for you. Hopefully this was a help, hopefully this has opened a few more doors for you, and after this we will have another video on its way soon with even more things. We'll have a look at the filter gallery soon and a few more of the individual tools, so hopefully you'll be there for those as well. For just now, please give this video a like, hit subscribe, or leave a comment down below. Share this with anyone that is starting their Photoshop journey as well, and maybe it'll just point them in the right direction on a few things. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you guys soon.